Imagine standing at your cabin door in -75-degree Siberian winter, the kind of cold that freezes your breath before it leaves your lips, and finding a pregnant Arctic wolf collapsing at your doorstep, leaving 3 newborn pups in the snow before disappearing into a blizzard so violent you cannot see your own hand in front of your face, and then imagine what that same wolf did 5 months later when spring arrived. Something so shocking that hardened Siberian villagers who had hunted wolves their entire lives stood frozen in disbelief, weapons lowered, tears streaming down weathered faces. What could a wild wolf possibly do that would make an entire village rethink everything they believed about these creatures, and why did she choose this one lonely old man to trust with her most precious gift? This is the story of Nikolai Petrov, a 73-year-old widower who had spent the last 11 years living alone in a small wooden cabin at the edge of the Siberian wilderness, a man who had seen more death than most people could imagine, first as a soldier in conflicts he never spoke about, then as a hunter who tracked wolves through these same frozen forests for decades, and finally as a husband who watched his beloved wife fade away from illness in that very cabin while the nearest doctor was 200 kilometers away through impassable snow. After her death, Nikolai stopped going to the village except when absolutely necessary, stopped speaking to neighbors who only reminded him of a life he no longer had, and settled into a routine so quiet that sometimes weeks would pass without him hearing the sound of another human voice. His days were simple and predictable: wake before dawn, stoke the fire that kept him alive, check his traps for rabbits or foxes, melt snow for drinking water, repair whatever needed repairing, and sit by the window as darkness fell, watching the endless white landscape that had become both his prison and his peace. The villagers in the nearby settlement thought he was strange, maybe even dangerous, this old hermit who preferred the company of silence to the warmth of community, but Nikolai had made peace with loneliness a long time ago, or at least he thought he had, until that night in January when the worst blizzard in 30 years came howling down from the Arctic Circle and brought something to his door that would change everything. The storm had been building for 3 days, temperatures dropping so low that even the wolves stopped hunting, and Nikolai knew from experience that these were the nights when death moved freely across the tundra, taking anything foolish enough to be caught outside. He had boarded up the windows, stacked enough wood by the fireplace to last a week, and settled in to wait it out like he had done 100 times before, but something felt different about this night, a strange restlessness that kept him awake even as the wind screamed against his walls. It was past midnight when he heard the sound, not the howl of the storm, but something else, something that made him grab his rifle and move toward the door despite every survival instinct telling him to stay inside. When he cracked open the door, the cold hit him like a physical force, stealing the air from his lungs, but what he saw made him forget the cold entirely. There, in the dim glow from his cabin window, was an Arctic wolf unlike any he had ever seen, pure white fur matted with ice, ribs visible through her coat, and eyes that held something Nikolai never expected to see in a wild predator: desperation. She was heavily pregnant, barely able to stand, and as Nikolai watched in stunned silence, she lowered herself into the snow and began giving birth right there at his doorstep, her body convulsing with effort while the wind tried to bury them both. 3 pups emerged, tiny and helpless, and the wolf looked at them, then looked at Nikolai, and in that moment something passed between them that the old hunter could not explain, some ancient understanding that transcended the history between their species. Then she did something that haunted Nikolai for months afterward. She pushed the pups toward his door with her nose, gave one long look at her newborns, and disappeared into the white darkness of the blizzard. Nikolai stood there for what felt like hours, though it could not have been more than a few seconds, his mind racing through everything he knew about wolves, about survival, about the cruel arithmetic of nature that sometimes forced mothers to make impossible choices. He understood what she had done. She was too weak to feed them, too exhausted to keep them warm, and the storm would kill all 4 of them before morning unless she found shelter and food. She had given them to him, this human who smelled of wolf blood and old death, because somehow she had sensed that he might do what she could not. The pups were crying now, high-pitched sounds that cut through the wind, and Nikolai felt something crack open in his chest, some frozen part of him that had been sealed away since he buried his wife in the permafrost behind the cabin. He bent down, scooped up all 3 pups in his weathered hands, and carried them inside. He did not know if the mother would survive the night. He did not know if these pups would live past morning. But he knew that he could not stand there and watch them freeze to death, not because it made logical sense, but because something deeper than logic was pulling at him, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. The first week was the hardest because Nikolai had no idea what he was doing and the pups seemed determined to die no matter what he tried. They were too young to eat solid food, so he spent hours each day carefully feeding them warm goat's milk from a makeshift bottle, a tedious process that required more patience than he thought he had left. He kept them in a wooden box lined with his dead wife's old blankets, positioned close enough to the fire for warmth but far enough to prevent burns, and he woke every 2 hours through the night to check on them, just like he imagined parents did with human infants. 2 of the pups were female, small and silver-gray beneath their white fur, but the third was male, larger than his sisters, with pale blue eyes that watched Nikolai with an intensity that was almost unsettling. The old man started calling him Vok, the Russian word for wolf, though he felt foolish giving a name to an animal he might have shot on sight just 1 year earlier. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, against all odds, the pups began to thrive. They opened their eyes, started exploring the cabin, tumbled over each other in clumsy play, and gradually began to see Nikolai not as a threat but as something else, something their instincts did not have a word for. There was one moment during the 3rd week that Nikolai never forgot. He had fallen asleep by the fire after a long day of chopping wood, and when he woke, all 3 pups were curled against his boots, tiny bodies pressed together for warmth, completely trusting this human who should have been their enemy. Something shifted in Nikolai that night, some weight lifted from his shoulders, and for the first time since his wife's death, he did not feel alone. But survival in Siberia is never that simple, and soon Nikolai faced problems he could not solve by building a warmer fire. His food supplies were running dangerously low because the blizzard had destroyed his trap lines, and the pups were eating more each day as they grew, their appetites putting pressure on rations meant for one old man. He made the difficult journey to the village twice in February, trudging through waist-deep snow to trade furs for goat's milk and dried meat, and each time he noticed the tension in the air, the suspicious glances from people who had known him for years but no longer trusted him. Wolves had been attacking livestock on the outskirts of the village, emboldened by the harsh winter, and the villagers were angry, scared, and looking for someone to blame. Viktor Sorokin, the village headman, had organized hunting parties to track down the wolves, and there was talk of pushing deeper into the wilderness, closer to Nikolai's cabin, to find the pack responsible. Nikolai said nothing about the pups because he knew what would happen if anyone discovered them, but he could feel the danger growing, could sense that it was only a matter of time before someone came asking questions he could not answer. He started varying his routes to the village, leaving before dawn to avoid being seen, buying supplies from different traders so no single person could track how much he was purchasing. It was exhausting, this constant vigilance, but every time he looked at the pups wrestling by the fire or sleeping in their box, he knew he would do whatever it took to protect them. Then, in late February, everything changed again. Nikolai was checking his traps at the edge of the tree line when he felt that prickling sensation at the back of his neck that had saved his life more times than he could count during his years as a soldier and hunter. He turned slowly, hand moving to the knife at his belt, and there she was. The mother wolf stood 30 meters away, half hidden by the snow-covered pines, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his heart stop. She looked different now, stronger than the dying creature who had collapsed at his door, her white coat thick and healthy, ribs no longer visible beneath her fur. Nikolai understood immediately she had survived the storm, found food, rebuilt her strength, and now she had come back. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Nikolai remembered all the wolves he had killed over the years, remembered the bounties he had collected, the furs he had sold, the reputation he had built as one of the deadliest hunters in the region. He waited for the guilt to overwhelm him, but it did not come, only a strange stillness, a recognition that the past was the past and this moment was something new. The wolf watched him for another minute, then turned and walked toward his cabin, moving with the silent grace that made her species such effective predators. Nikolai followed at a distance, fear and curiosity battling in his chest, until they reached the clearing where his home stood. The wolf stopped, lifted her head, and made a sound that Nikolai had never heard before, a low whine that was almost musical. Inside the cabin, the pups went wild, yipping and scratching at the door, recognizing their mother's voice despite the months of separation. Nikolai opened the door, and the pups tumbled out into the snow, rushing toward the white wolf with a joy that was unmistakable. The mother greeted each one, sniffing them, nuzzling them, making soft sounds that could only be described as relief. Then she looked at Nikolai, met his eyes directly, and held his gaze for several heartbeats. There was no aggression in her stare, no fear, just something that the old man could only interpret as acknowledgement, maybe even gratitude. Then she turned and walked back toward the forest, disappearing among the trees, leaving the pups behind. She had come to check on them, Nikolai realized. She had come to see if he had kept them safe. And she had decided, apparently, that they were better off with him for now. Spring arrived slowly to Siberia that year, creeping across the land in subtle shifts of temperature and light, melting the endless white into patches of brown and green that seemed miraculous after so many months of frozen stillness. The pups were nearly full-grown now, their playful tumbling replaced by more coordinated movements, their bodies lengthening into the powerful frames that would eventually make them formidable hunters. Nikolai knew he should release them, should open the door one morning and walk away, let them return to the wild where they belonged, but something kept stopping him, some reluctance he could not quite name. The village was still buzzing with wolf-hunting talk, still organizing parties to push deeper into the forest, and releasing 3 young wolves now would be like painting targets on their backs. So he waited, hoping the hunting fever would die down, hoping the villagers would find other concerns. But fate, as it often does in stories like this, had different plans entirely. It happened on the first truly warm day of April, when the ice on the river finally cracked and the sound of flowing water filled the air for the first time in months. Nikolai was returning from the village when he saw the smoke, not the thin wisps of cooking fires, but great black columns rising from the direction of the settlement, spreading across the sky like a wound. He ran, old legs protesting but carrying him forward anyway, and what he saw when he reached the village edge stopped him cold. Fire had broken out in the forest on the eastern side of the settlement, driven by dry winter brush and unexpected winds, and it was moving toward the village faster than anyone could stop it. People were running everywhere, grabbing children, pulling livestock, shouting contradictory orders that no one followed. But the real horror was at the center of the chaos. A group of children, 7 of them, had been playing in the forest when the fire started, and now they were trapped on the wrong side of the blaze, cut off from their families by walls of flame and smoke. Viktor Sorokin was screaming for volunteers, men who would risk the inferno to find a path to the children, but the fire was too intense, the smoke too thick, and everyone who tried was driven back within minutes, coughing and burned. Mothers were crying, fathers were praying, and a horrific certainty was settling over the crowd. The children were going to die, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. That is when she appeared. The white wolf emerged from the smoke like a ghost, her fur dusted with ash, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the flames. Behind her came the 3 young wolves that Nikolai had raised, now nearly as large as their mother, their coats marked with soot but their bodies unharmed. The villagers screamed, some raising weapons instinctively, but the wolf ignored them completely, walking straight to Nikolai and meeting his eyes with that same intense stare he had come to know so well. Then she turned toward the burning forest, took a few steps, and looked back at him. There was no mistaking her meaning. "Follow me." Nikolai grabbed Viktor's arm and pointed at the wolf, his voice hoarse from the smoke as he said, "She knows a way, she is showing us a path to the children." Viktor looked at him like he was insane, but desperation does strange things to people, and with no other options remaining, he shouted for 2 of his strongest men to follow the old hermit into the flames. They plunged into the smoke behind the wolves, moving through the chaos while flames roared on either side, heat searing their skin and ash filling their lungs, and somehow miraculously, impossibly, the wolves led them through gaps in the fire that no human would have seen, around burning trees that collapsed seconds after they passed, across shallow streams that created natural barriers against the flames, until they emerged in a small clearing where 7 terrified children huddled together, crying for their parents, convinced they were going to die. The rescue party gathered the children and followed the wolves back through the same impossible route, the white wolf pausing at each dangerous crossing to ensure everyone made it through safely, until finally they emerged on the safe side of the fire just as the section they had crossed collapsed into an inferno that would have killed them all. Parents rushed forward, grabbing their children, sobbing with relief so powerful it seemed to shake the earth, while the rest of the villagers stood speechless, staring at the 4 wolves who had just done the impossible. No one moved to raise a weapon. No one shouted threats or curses. Viktor Sorokin, the man who had organized wolf hunts all winter, the man who had killed more wolves than anyone in the region, slowly lowered his rifle to the ground and turned to look at Nikolai with eyes full of something the old man had never expected to see: understanding, and perhaps even shame. The wolves did not stay. The mother gave Nikolai one last look, that same deep gaze full of things humans do not have words for, holding his eyes for a long moment as if to say everything that needed to be said without a single sound. Then she turned and led her children into the forest, for white shapes disappearing into the green shadows of the trees, returning to the wild where they belonged. Nikolai watched them go until the smoke swallowed their forms, and he felt something he had not felt in 11 years, tears running down his weathered cheeks, warm against skin that had forgotten how to cry. The villagers came to him afterward, one by one, asking questions he could not answer, thanking him for something he had not done alone. Victor shook his hand and announced that the wolf hunts would stop, not just for now, but forever, at least in the territory where the white wolf and her pack roamed. And when Nikolai finally walked back to his cabin that evening, exhausted and aching but strangely at peace, he found something unexpected waiting at his doorstep: a fresh rabbit, still warm, left exactly where the pups had been placed on that frozen night so many months ago. He understood now what the wolf had been doing all along. She had not just left her pups with him because she was desperate. She had recognized something in him, some capacity for mercy that even he had not known he possessed, some goodness buried beneath years of killing and grief and isolation. And when the time came, when his people needed help, she had returned that mercy in the only way she could, risking her life and the lives of her children to save creatures she had every reason to fear and hate. Survival in Siberia is brutal and unforgiving, a constant battle against cold and hunger and death that hardens everyone who endures it. But sometimes, in the harshest conditions, strange alliances are born, alliances that remind us why compassion matters even when it makes no logical sense, even when the world gives us every excuse to be cruel. Nikolai lived another 8 years in that cabin, surrounded by neighbors who finally understood him, respected by a village that had once thought him strange and dangerous, and though he never saw the white wolf again, sometimes at night he would hear howling in the distance, for voices raised together in a song that seemed meant just for him, and he would smile, knowing that somewhere in the frozen wilderness, his strange family was thriving, remembering him just as he remembered them. He was never alone again.